There is a story buried under American soil, a story erased from textbooks, hidden from classrooms, and buried under centuries of silence. It is the story of Africa and America, long before slavery, long before colonization, long before Europeans ever set foot on the continent. This is the history they never wanted you to know. Africans arrived in America long before Columbus. For generations, people were taught a single narrative, that Africans only entered America as enslaved people. But the evidence tells a different story. Ancient explorers from West Africa, especially from the Mali Empire, were known for crossing the Atlantic long before the 1400s. Archaeologists have found African-style carvings, sculptures, and artifacts in parts of South America and Central America that predate Columbus. Even early European explorers wrote about black-skinned people already present in the Americas. But this chapter was erased because it changes everything. The Malian Voyages, a story that shocked scholars. One of the most powerful forgotten tales is the voyage of Abu Bakr II, the Emperor of Mali. He ruled one of the richest civilizations on Earth, more advanced than most of Europe. He did something unimaginable. He built a massive fleet and sailed west, straight into the Atlantic, with thousands of explorers, scientists, and navigators. His goal? To discover what lay beyond the horizon. And many historians now believe his expeditions reached the Americas centuries before Columbus. Traces of Malian cultural influence still appear in indigenous traditions, architecture, and symbols across South America. But this was never taught in school. African knowledge that changed the Americas. African travelers carried knowledge systems that reshaped the continent. Advanced agriculture, and metallurgy. The navigation, mathematics, astronomy, mind design, architecture. Even certain crops found in the Americas, like yam, bottle gourd, and African rice, show genetic links with West Africa. How could African crops be in America before Columbus? Someone had to bring them. But this fact threatens the myth that Africa contributed nothing to world civilization. So it remained hidden, Africa's spiritual footprint in native cultures. Across the Caribbean and South America, early indigenous tribes practiced traditions that closely resemble West African spiritual systems, drumming patterns, masks, ancestor worship, dance styles, and storytelling rhythms. These similarities are not accidents. Cultures meet, cultures mix, cultures leave fingerprints. They were not alone on their land. They met Africans, explorers, traders, and navigators long before Europeans ever arrived. This part of history was quietly removed from the story. The reason this history was erased. If Africans reached America early, if Africans influenced indigenous societies, if Africans were explorers, not just enslaved people, then Europe loses the narrative of discovery. Their version of history collapses. So the easiest solution was simple: erase the evidence, silence the scholars, rewrite the books. And so Africa's true global legacy disappeared from American education. The survivors who carried the ancient memory. When enslaved Africans were brought to the Americas centuries later, they brought their knowledge, identities, and cultures, even under chains. Despite oppression, they preserved names, languages, drums, Udi spiritual systems, stories, warrior traditions, and Daoist architectural techniques. African fingerprints remain everywhere in the Americas, in music, in food, in language, in religion, in place names, even in the DNA of millions of people. America is more African than anyone was ever allowed to admit. The African footprint in the Americas they couldn't erase. Even after centuries of attempts to hide the truth, evidence of Africa's early presence in the Americas is everywhere. In the land, in the culture, and in the people. Archaeologists working across South America and the Caribbean uncovered stone carvings with distinctly African facial features. Broad noses, full lips, braided hairstyles, identical to the ancient people of the Mali Empire. Some indigenous oral traditions even speak of black travelers who came from the rising sun, bringing ironworking, advanced farming, and new musical instruments. This is not coincidence. This is memory that survived colonization, war, and rewriting of history. African technology and science shaped early America. African navigators were among the most scientifically advanced of their age. Their ships were not small wooden canoes. They were large, expertly engineered vessels, capable of crossing the Atlantic Ocean long before Europe had that capability. They carried metal tools, advanced compasses, astronomical navigation knowledge, mathematics from Timbuktu, complex boat-building techniques. These innovations were far ahead of many European societies of the same era. So imagine what it meant when such explorers reached the shores of the Americas. Their influence can be seen in agricultural methods used by early tribes, African-style terracing found in parts of South America, the blacksmithing techniques identical to West Africa, drum patterns still used in Caribbean spiritual ceremonies. History did not erase these connections. It only hid them. The erased truth about African-American identity. When Africans were later enslaved and taken to the United States, they carried with them fragments of ancient memory, fragments of a past where Africa was not just a victim of history, but a maker of history. What the world was taught is that African Americans began their story in chains. But the true story begins long before that, with explorers, scientists, kings, sailors, and civilizations whose brilliance reached across oceans. European powers hid this truth for one reason. If people of African descent discovered they came from explorers and empire builders, not from a history of helplessness, the psychological chains of slavery would weaken. And so the narrative was buried, the power in knowing the real history. When you understand that Africa reached the Americas before Europe, when you understand that African science shaped early American societies, when you understand that indigenous cultures preserved African memory, you begin to see a new picture of history. Africa was global. Africa was connected. Africa was never isolated. And Africans were never just victims. They were architects of civilization. This truth restores identity. This truth restores dignity. This truth restores power. Jamaica's secret history isn't just a story. It's a reminder. You can take a people from their land, but you cannot erase their identity. Jamaica is African. Jamaica is rebellious. Jamaica is powerful. Jamaica is legacy. And that is the wild secret they never wanted the world to know.